Good day to you. You know, the public relations on Mexico hasn't exactly been overall favorable to the country. I bet most of you at some point when watching these videos have asked yourself, geez, is he riding around on buses with chickens? Are there tumbleweeds blowing through the streets? Is it really dangerous that you might get beheaded when you walk downtown by a drug cartel? These are some of the images of Mexico that have gotten out, and while somewhat true in some limited circumstances, mostly along border towns, for the vast majority of Mexico, it's a peaceful and fun-loving and very healthy country to spend time in. I actually feel safer here in Mazatlan, Mexico, than I do in my own hometown of East Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. So public relations can have a really beneficial, or in Mexico's case, kind of a devastating effect on a particular country. And it introduces the subject that we're discussing in today's instructor video. It's all about the chapter on public relations, which has had a pretty checkered past in terms of the way that people think of public relations. Some people think of it as a kind of way of pretending to be something that a company is really not. It's like taking a company like BP, which is British Petroleum and is in the business of extracting oil from the ground, and presenting it as a really environmentally friendly, green-oriented company when in actual fact it polluted the Gulf of Mexico for several years because of an oil spill, and the Gulf of Mexico is still recovering from that. That's just one interpretation. I'm not saying it's mine, but I'm giving an idea of how public relations has been perceived by some people to be kind of a dishonest profession. But actually it can be a very noble profession. It's one of the reasons that in our major of communication studies, it's offered as a concentration. It's to try and present public relations and to solidify it as a noble profession. So let's move on with public relations, which is basically about a company or an institution or a person interacting with different publics. We'll talk about what makes up a public a little bit later in this video, but it's the idea that you have more than one public, and we'll discuss how that plays out in a couple examples a little bit later. The very first example of public relations that's often talked about historically is Thomas Paine, a pivotal figure in the lead for the separation of the United States, then at that time the colonies, from England. In other words, he was part of the Revolution. You can find some plaques that are commemorating Thomas Paine if you walk around Philadelphia. At any rate, he published a newsletter called Common Sense, and it was all about promoting how good it would be for the colonies to break away from England. Another early example of public relations, also sort of giving it a bad name, was P.T. Barnum, one of the originators of circuses in the United States. And P.T. Barnum came across the idea that if he wrote letters to the editors of newspapers and talked about how bad the circus was, that it actually would raise more awareness and would raise more attention on the part of the public to the circus, and people would go out to see if it was as macabre and as grotesque as he made it seem. And he sort of invented the idea that there's no such thing as bad PR. All PR is good for a company because it draws attention to it. So this was some of the first ways that public relations was practiced, but it didn't really become studied until Ivy Lee, one of the co-founders of PR, started to study it from an economic and a psychological standpoint. That was his background. He was an academic, and he eventually came up with a declaration of principles that PR practitioners should follow when they practice public relations. Basically trying to establish an ethical code, like you shouldn't lie, for example, when you're talking about an institution or a product. So Ivy Lee was credited as one of the co-founders. The second co-founder of PR was Edward Bernays. Edward Bernays brought an engineering background to public relations. He used a lot of public opinion polling to try and establish messages that the public would find to be suitable to their interests and tastes. And so Edward Bernays is known as the person who came up with the concept of engineering consent. Engineering, like it was a scientific method of getting people to agree that something is good or something is bad based on public relations. So right now, for example, we have a lot of public relations going on talking about climate change. It's being done by governments all over the world. And here in Pennsylvania and in Mexico, the climate has been very different this year as compared to last year. It's been very, very warm in Pennsylvania, as you well know. Is that something that's part of nature's natural cycles, or is it because of climate change? Well, there's a lot of evidence that the temperature in Pennsylvania has risen in an average way and is going to only continue to go up. And just a couple degrees and change in temperature, 3 degrees as it's projected to be by the year 2050 will result in a completely different climate in Pennsylvania, where even the trees are going to look a lot different. We won't quite see palm trees like this behind me, but we'll see a lot of trees that are more common in Washington, Virginia, and South Carolina and Pennsylvania because of the climate change. That's what scientists are saying. And so the PR that's gone on, that's to try and communicate that, has been to try and get people to consent to that opinion. Not everybody does, but it's a process of presenting scientific research and covering conferences like President Obama attended in Paris last month. This is all part of engineering consent. Edward Bernays was really the first person to practice public relations, or at least theorize that it should be practiced this way, as two-way communication. It's not just simply of sending a message out to a public like the railroads did. They were, after all, the very first really big companies to use PR, just sending out messages, positive messages, trying to distract the average consumer from realizing that they were monopolies and that they were raising ticket prices and that they were presenting unsafe working conditions and that there were accidents that were happening that were not being reported. This is what the railroads did. They did it by bribing journalists. They gave them free tickets. They allowed them to come out and accept cash payments. And so the journalists positively covered the railroads. That's all top-down, one-way communication. It's not what Edward Bernays practiced. Edward Bernays practiced two-way communication. In fact, he and Ivy Lee were part of the idea that instead of railroads trying to cover up accidents, why not invite journalists out, give them free and unfettered access to the situation at the site of an accident, and journalists will cover it in fairness. We even see that at play today in terms of the military. When the military goes into a war, as our military did in the Gulf War, reporters were invited to accompany some of the expeditions, some of the incursions into enemy territory. There were some rules, of course, as far as getting close to the battleground, but in that case, they are going to more favorably cover the U.S.'s military excursions because they are embedded with military personnel. They become friendly with them, they become associated with them, they understand the trials and tribulations that they're going through, so it generally becomes a situation where the coverage is favorable to the U.S. military. That's just an example of two-way communication. It's an example of PR as it's integrated into the organization that's using the PR. Now, the government was also one of the first, aside from the military, was one of the first practitioners of public relations. During World War I, Woodrow Wilson actually established a government committee on releasing public information, and this was to promote the idea that it was necessary for the United States to get involved in World War I. It was a kind of public relations enacted by the federal government. In the 1940s and 1950s, PR really took off as an academic discipline. Universities started to offer it as a widely offered curriculum. Mostly in communication departments or communication studies departments such as ours. So we have PR developing as a very viable profession, and actually in our major, communication studies, it's the largest concentration that we offer. We offer concentrations in broadcasting and media studies and public communication and advocacy, but the public relations concentration has almost 100 students in it. So it's a very, very successful field and career, and it starts with the study of it in academic universities. Now let's move on to Edward Bernays' three functions of public relations as he developed it into an academic discipline, or helped develop it. He talked about how PR has three functions. One is informing the public, the second one is persuading the public, and the third is integrating the institution with the publics that they're trying to serve. So let's take, for example, the whole idea of reducing sugar intake. It's something that the government has somewhat gotten behind over the years, although it still has not gotten behind it that idea as much as England and other countries, but at least taking sugar out of public schools where children are eating lunches. The first is to inform them how many calories are in the desserts that children are eating, as opposed to eating apples and fruits. The second is persuading the public that the school lunch menu needs to be modified and in some ways regulated so that it doesn't offer things with white sugar so that things with white sugar in them are not offered as part of the school lunch menu. And then third is the integrating, is how to put the public in touch with the schools. So you have Parents Teachers Association, for example, PTAs or PTOs as they're sometimes called, which is a place where parents meet with school officials, and that's where materials are distributed on behalf of government agencies trying to talk about this idea of sugar in the school lunch menus. So that's an example of the three functions that Bernays talked about. Now let's move on to the PR process. What's involved if you are a PR firm or if you're a company that has a PR function? What are the processes? There are 5 of them. The first is research. That's knowing your audience, knowing their perceptions. It involves public opinion polling. It involves observation. It involves collection of data through people's habits and their purchases. The second is objectives. Objectives is what are you trying to achieve with your PR campaign, as it's often called. So let's take the idea of Subaru. Subaru is a car company that has decided that it's going to try and appeal to consumers who have a green and outdoor sporty initiative in them. That's what they enjoy doing. They enjoy not destroying the environment, but they enjoy going out and getting into it. So one of the objectives, perhaps, of Subaru is to get its vehicles to be seen as green-friendly cars. And that's why many of them have a PZEV brand, PZEV, that's on the back of their vehicle. I don't know exactly what it stands for, but basically it has to do with low carbon emissions. It's part of their branding. Otherwise, they wouldn't put it on the back of their vehicles to meet their objective of trying to remind people that they are concerned about the environment. The third part of the PR process is programming. That is coming up with the content that's going to achieve that. And I just gave that example of putting the branding of Subaru on the back. But also, when they show Subaru in Subaru vehicles in television ads, they show them going out into nature. They don't show them spinning out in the middle of a big urban environment like Chrysler might do in the middle of Philadelphia, or a Mustang on an open road. Subarus are going out into the country, sort of conquering mountains and rivers and deserts. The third is evaluation. That is to make sure that you are always evaluating your campaign, providing mechanisms for people to make comments on social media, making sure that you're continuing public opinion polling, looking at sales figures if sales is involved. Make sure you're evaluating your message. And the fourth is stewardship. Stewardship is making sure that you are guiding this campaign in an ethical manner, not just using every trick in the book to try and fool the audience. Now, we mentioned that term publics at the outset of this class. Publics refers to the really different audiences, but what makes a public different from an audience is often a commercial term used to describe a set of clients or viewers or consumers that are purchasing a product or watching advertisements, etc. Publics refers sometimes to people, groups of people who are not in it for the money. And there are internal publics and external publics. So if we look at East Stroudsburg University, for example, as an institution, the internal public are the students and the professors and the staff members and the administrators. And so you have listserv messages that go out to people. You have emails that go out to people at the university. You have televisions around campus that are displaying coursework. You have events like Warrior football games and other sports. These are all part of public relations strategies that are trying to appeal to an internal public. And that public is going to be very different from external publics. External publics would be like the town-gown relationship, as it's often called. That is people who live around East Stroudsburg University. That's why the president at the beginning of the fall semester walks around with a group of ESU staff members and knocks on doors of family members who live next to the university, asking them if they have any concerns about ESU. And it gives them an opportunity to talk about partying and loud noises and trash being thrown on the street and other kinds of things that could irritate homeowners, but it's a proactive approach and it's dealing with an external public. It's a different kind of message that's going to be developed for the internal public at ESU. Another dimension of PR is crisis communication. Crisis communication is something you always have to be prepared for as a firm because things could go wrong and your stock prices could plummet. Sales of an object could plummet. You could have a lot of problems. Volkswagen is having a lot of problems because it was revealed that it cheated on its emissions tests. And Volkswagen has been known as one of the most stalwart German auto engineering brands since its history. It's known as very reliable, it's very mechanically sound, very solid vehicles that last a long time. But people have had their perception of the reputation of Volkswagen damaged. So what does a company do? Well, Volkswagen has announced that it has given each Volkswagen owner a rebate of money if you own one of these vehicles that had the emission reports misreported. So it's a great example of how you deal with crises. Edward Bernays talked about how when you deal with crises, you have to be prepared, you have to be honest, Ivy Lee also talked about this. You have to be honest, don't lie. You have to apologize if you're wrong. You have to be quick in responding to the crisis, and then you have to communicate with your stockholders and your other publics and the press, especially, or media as it's known. You have to engage in all those things very strategically if you're going to handle a crisis so that your company doesn't go under. Then there's PR and the internet, and this has really provided a tool the internet has to institutions to communicate directly with their publics. You can go onto websites now and you can create messages. If you're a company, if you're a startup company, or if you're a Best Buy company, a big company like Best Buy, your internet webpage is constantly communicating your public relations with your publics, as opposed to having to go through TV ads or direct mailers or newspaper ads. The internet has really provided that. And social media is something that institutions have had to learn to deal with from a public relations standpoint, because things can go wrong. Consumers, or prosumers as they're often called, can start to post negative things about McDonald's meals or about Netflix. If you go to look for a hotel that you want to stay in, you can read on TripAdvisor some reviews, and somebody may have had a very bad experience, and so they write about how the bathroom wasn't clean, for example, or there were bed bugs in the bed. That can be devastating to an organization like a hotel in terms of other customers deciding to stay there or not. And so you find hotels responding to that and pointing out what they've done to correct the problem, or maybe correcting the information. It's all part of social media and what it's brought to the table in public relations. PR and society has a unique relationship as well. A lot of the news that we see in news reports and in newspapers, radio, and TV are generated from public relations releases. If Amazon releases a public relations, puts out a press release that it's going to start selling drones, and that you will be able to purchase your own drone or have products delivered by drone from Amazon, that becomes a news item. But it also becomes a way of promoting or giving positive public relations to Amazon. 40 to 90% of news in the news cycle comes from PR releases like that. PR is also closely related to the government. The government is constantly using press releases. President Obama has released a press release that he's going to be, he hasn't released it directly, but it's been leaked from the White House that there's going to be some gun restrictions that are going to be rolled out shortly here as part of an executive order that President Obama is supposedly going to release. It's an example of government using public relations to try and influence the public. And speaking of government, there's a whole idea of spin control. Spin control is that you try to take a crisis and put a different spin on it. For example, when Donald Trump announced that he was in favor of stopping Muslims from coming into the United States, when there was a strong public reaction, and some of it was favorable to that idea amongst his base of supporters, he also backpedaled a little bit and said, well, it's going to be temporary. That could be an example of spin control. It's taking a concept that's out there and then spinning it to make it more favorably. PR has also been used as a form of political activism. If we look at gay marriage, for example, there were a lot of press releases and a lot of coverage of news events where people were silently protesting current policies and laws against gay marriage to try and create a viewpoint amongst the American public that gay marriage is an acceptable form of union between two people who love each other. And finally, we have PR and civil rights. Yes, this fly is annoying. We have PR and civil rights, and it's the idea that you can create change in society to provide basic rights to individuals through public relations. The gay rights one is an example. We also see an increasing movement, though not everybody agrees with this, that everybody should have health coverage. It's a basic right. PR is used to try and create that in the form of advertisements, in the form of marketing, in the form of releasing information. It's a way of creating more civil harmony in the United States and other countries using media. So that sums up our class on public relations. I hope you have a great day.